So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have reached the appointed hour, so I think we can start. Don't be surprised if when the buzzer goes for any latecomers, because it makes quite a loud noise. If we get inundated with lots of people, then of course we can begin to take the tables out. I remember once being at a seminar where we began by taking out one table, and then another one, then another one, then another one, until there were no tables left. But that's the way we can create more if we need to. I should introduce myself for those of you whom I've not yet met. My name is David Shankland. I'm the new chairman of the Anglo-Turkish Society. And of course I should be delighted to talk with everybody and see what sort of things that the Society can usefully do in the future. Although of course it has a very fine pedigree. I remember giving my first papers to the Society already more than 20 years ago. If not, soon to be sadly 30 years, but never mind. It's also a great pleasure to welcome you, of course, to the Royal Anthropological Institute, where I'm director. It's nice to think that we can use this room to talk about things on Turkey as much as we want, really, in future years. But this evening we have the great privilege to welcome Barbara Nadel to speak about her work. And just to remind you about the format, that Barbara will speak for, I think, about an hour about her work, and then we'll discuss things pretty much as we wish to afterwards, so very straightforward. So thank you very much, and we should just welcome our speaker.
Right, thank you very much. It's really nice to see so many people here tonight. I have given talks in the past, literally to one man and his dog. I kid you not. You never know as an author what kind of audience you're going to get, unless you are one of the big bestsellers, and then they go down the street. I did a talk once with the great, may he be blessed, Ian Rankin, when I was in America a few years ago, and there was this queue. It was a bookshop in Los Angeles, and there was this queue that went down the road and round the corner and everything. And for one moment I thought, oh, they've all come to see me. Of course they hadn't. I think there were two of them that had come to see me. But never mind, it's just the way it is. Right, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to give a talk about, it's basically about it's a very personal thing. It's about my observations of Turkey since the 1970s, when I first went there. And I didn't start writing my Inspector Ikmen books in the 1970s, but having said that, those early trips did inform a lot of what happened later on. But what I've done is I've kind of cut this talk up into sections, and we will start with the 1970s, and I'll tell you why I went there. Some of you may know, because I also write a series of books set in East London, that's where I come from. I am a child of the 60s, which gives my age away, ancient. I'm sure I'll get a blue plaque one of these days. But I grew up in East London at a time when, to give you an example, at the bottom of our road was just a big hole where a bomb had dropped during the Second World War. And this was sort of, 1968 sort of thing, and nobody had done anything. But we were kind of used to that, we had hot and cold running damp, and it was just it was a bit of a difficult life, really. But for kids, it was good as well. It was brilliant in a way, because we used to play in all these bomb holes and everything. I can still remember sliding down into bomb craters and thinking, this is amazing. Maybe there's a bomb at the bottom and I'll set it off. Didn't think I'd die, but kids don't, do they? So that was the sort of background that I came from. The 70s came along, and in the late 70s, I was a teenager, and I was a working class East End teenager, and I didn't know what to do with myself, because in spite of what you may hear about, there were all lots of opportunities years ago, there weren't really. Not for people like me. We didn't even know how to go about it. Sometimes people say to me, what did you feel like when you got published, first of all? And I said, well, I was so shocked. I nearly had to have smelling salts because people like, it doesn't happen to people like us, you know, it's a weird, weird thing. I had very few prospects as a teenager. My parents were poor, you know, what were you going to do? So we had a family connection to Turkey. But I had not been there. So in the late 70s, I decided that, you know, rather than carry on cleaning people's floors and serving food at a local cafe, that I would just go away and see what the world was about. So I literally, if you'll excuse the expression, buggered off to Turkey. I did it in a way that that is very peculiar, because most of the young people that were leaving this country to explore and to go abroad were doing things like getting the magic bus or the train across Europe or anything. Well, you know, when you come from my background, you don't know anything about that sort of thing. So you think, well, how do I get there then? So you think, well, I have to buy a holiday. So I saved up and I bought a holiday for myself. I then stayed on after this holiday because I enjoyed it so much. But when I got to Turkey, it was, I can really, really relate to Orhan Pamuk and his description of Istanbul in the 1970s, because it really struck me. I arrived at night, and in spite of the fact that it was nighttime, I think I really thought that, you know, everything was going to be lit up and everything was going to be bright because it was the Mediterranean. And of course I got there in the middle of the night to what was then Yeşilköy Airport, which, for those of you who went to Yeşilköy Airport, you will probably remember a sort of, I just remember kind of huts and strange concrete buildings, and that was all a bit strange. Driving in to the city from the airport, the thing that struck me the most was how familiar everything was to me, because East London was like that at the time. So, so it was a sort of monochrome environment. And it wasn't until I woke up the next morning and the sun was shining that I realised that I was in a very, very different place. But one of the things that kept on coming back to me during those first visits in the late 70s was how similar it was to where I came from. Because you know, you'd read these accounts from other Brits and they'd say, you know, God, it's really dark at night, there's nobody about, you know, it's really strange. And I'm thinking, but that's just like home without the pubs. You know, that, because that is how it was. Potholed roads, which of course, you know, still have them, don't we? We all still have them now. And the only other Brits that I met around and about were very, very peculiar. They were hippies. It was kind of at the end of the hippie period. I remember I went to the pudding shop, because you had to, and there were, well, I found them very exotic and strange, because they were sort of middle-class people. And, you know, they were talking about, well, you know, when I finish here, I'm going to Afghanistan. And I'm thinking, Afghanistan, where is that? I don't even know. You know. And also, some very peculiar aristocratic people were wandering around as well. I remember I met two ladies, and they must have been sort of like relics from the Victorian age. I mean, I know I was young, and we always tend to think people are very old and they turn out to be 40. But these ladies were old, and they were outrageous as well. One was called Lettuce, and the other one was called Petunia, which are, you know, sort of like almost archetypal Victorian names. And they described themselves as ex-courtesans. I don't know who they were courtesans for. Maybe it was, I don't know, King Edward VII or something. I really don't know. But they were drifting around as well. As I say, it was a strange, but because it was that bit different, I felt comfortable there. I mean, you know, East London at that time was a place that was full of the smell of drains, it was full of the smell of cigarettes, you know, and so we had all that going on. I'm thinking, you know, did I go home when I wasn't noticing or something? But I soon discovered that it was actually very, very different from my home, and I fell in love with it. Things that sort of popped out sort of later to me, I guess, really. Things that I remember from that time. There was only one Bosphorus Bridge, of course, in those days, which I found absolutely marvellous. But of course, there wasn't the level of traffic then. The main street, Istiklal Caddesi, was two-way traffic then. It wasn't pedestrianised, and it was absolutely chaotic, and I loved it. I fell in love with Beyoğlu completely because it had that wonderful atmosphere of sort of chaos, which I was, you know, very used to, but there were different sounds, there were different sights. I'd never seen an old Chevrolet car before. And of course, a lot of the dolmushes in those days were old Chevrolet cars. And I'd heard about these shared taxis, and I thought, well, you know, I'll have to give this a go. So you just, you know, stand there, you chuck your arm out, and somebody stops, and they drag you into this huge American car, and you just sit or lay or do whatever you have to do to get in there and pay a very small amount of money to the driver, and then get out somewhere. I thought it was absolutely marvellous. Also, as some of you will remember, there was a lot of political strife at that time. It was leftists and rightists in those days. And I know somebody said to me when I came home, did that not bother you at all? Because I did see demonstrations on the street, you know. And I said, well, to be perfectly honest, similar things were happening here. It was not anything, again, that was particularly unusual to me, because we, in the late 70s, had a lot of industrial strife going on, as, I don't know, some of you may or may not remember. The other thing that I noticed as well, and these are disappearing now, I have a peculiar liking for Soviet-style buildings. I have no idea why. You know, if somebody says, I'm going to the Czech Republic in the new year, and I want to go and see the alchemists' houses in Prague. Some of my ancestors came from Prague, and I would like to see where they lived. And also on my list are various sort of bunkers and tower blocks and things like this, and my husband says, why do you want to see those? I go, that's the whole Soviet thing, it's the whole Cold War thing. I think things have got so bad in the world, I'm now sort of, you know, I'm now nostalgic for that time, which is a bit tragic, really. It's like, I really like the Ataturk Cultural Centre. I do, I'm very fond of it. I have been to concerts there. And of course, those styles, you know, here and in Turkey, that style of building is not in favour anymore, and they're all coming down. But again, you know, that was something that struck me, because when people talked about Turkey, and I had a big row about this with my publisher at one time, people would talk about palaces and the mosques. And yes, I find all those things very fascinating. But I also like the other stuff as well. I like the peculiar stuff. And I remember at one time with my book covers, we went through a whole series of mosques. And in the end, it became absolutely ludicrous. And I said to my publisher, look, there are other things in Turkey apart from mosques. And they went, oh yeah, but you know, this is real kind of publishing stuff, you know, how to get people to buy your books. Yes, but in the public imagination, that's what it is. And going, yeah, but you know, I think we should grow up a bit and move out, you know. So they moved out for 5 minutes and then moved back again. So we still have great buildings at the moment. So what I'm going to do is, my first book, which is a book called Belshazzar's Daughter, I wrote this in the early 90s. I'm going to read you a passage from it, which illustrates that sort of feeling that I got when I was in Beirut, right from the 70s, which carried on into the 1990s. I mean, things have changed more in more recent years, but it carried through, and it informed a description that I wrote, which I'll read you in a minute if I can get the machine to do what it's supposed to do. The first book was, as I say, I wrote it in 1992. I didn't get it published until 1999, and that was because I didn't know what I was doing and used to send this thing to random people. You know, do you work in publishing? Yeah. Do you want to read my book? Not really. Oh, well, I'll send it to you anyway, you know, because I'm bored. But I was actually working for the NHS at the time, so that was... But it didn't get published, and I remember one particular publisher, who shall remain nameless, sent me a note with the manuscript, sent it back, which said, "Turkey, are you having a laugh?" Which I've still got. It amused me intensely. But then, because the reason that it got published was we had, as my family has, periodic crises. And in 1999, we had a huge crisis. My husband lost his extremely good job. And we went from being really quite well off to living on my money, and I was working for the NHS, which is a bit like living on nothing. So I dragged this thing out of a drawer and thought, right, okay, well, we'll give it a go. And somebody took it, because I actually sent it to an agent at that time. I'd learnt by that time, you have to have literary agents. Right, okay, the little bit I'm going to read to you here this is from the first book, and it's a character, he's an English character. He's a language teacher, it's called Robert. And he is going to see his girlfriend, who lives in Beirut, in a rather extraordinary house. In sort of British criminal style, I actually changed the name of the little alleyway that I discovered where this was happening, because, as you may or may not know, we do have a bit of a tradition here of, if something terrible happens, like Fred West, they knocked the house down and they changed the name of the street. And also, if any of you are watching something called Rillington Place on television, Christie, I went in search of Rillington Place once, and it's really hard to find, because they knocked the whole row of houses down and they changed the name, and people even now won't tell you where it is.
Where is
it? Notting Hill. It's in Notting Hill, which was right rough in the old days. Okay, so I'll just read you this little snippet to give you an idea of what I saw. The second turning on the left was just beyond the patisserie. A slight gap in the endless procession of shop windows showed Robert where it was. A dark and noisy shoe mender's kiosk stood on the left-hand corner. A ladies' underwear shop on the right, which is now gone. Karadeniz Sokak was a long, narrow alley. It was old, tall Victorian buildings packed tightly on either side, some of them galleried, top-heavy, leaning towards each other as if attempting to kiss across the middle of the street. It sloped downwards, falling away from the main thoroughfare towards Mezrutiyet Caddesi and the green and white confection of the Pera Palace Hotel. As he made his way forward, Robert could just see the front entrance of the famous building, the Art Deco canopy suspended over the revolving doors of the front entrance. Blackened with age, the structures on either side of him looked very mournful, somewhat uninhabited, their broken windows echoing to the sound of his footsteps as the other more joyful noises of life on Istiklal Caddesi receded into the distance. So not the sort of, you know, hedonistic, rather wild area that it was until quite recently and has now changed a bit again. It was a dark and dingy place with run-down buildings, some of which, I believe this still does happen occasionally, spontaneously fall down. A friend of mine actually saw that a few years ago and was really quite shocked, and had lived in Istanbul all her life but had never actually seen that. So that gives you an idea of the sort of dark world that first attracted me. Moving forward into the 1980s, I remained fascinated by the country. By this time, I'd sorted myself out a bit, and somebody had told me I might be a bit clever, so I went to university. But before I did that, I had a child and I got married and all that sort of business. So, and we were, you know, we didn't have much money. So Turkey kind of receded into the background somewhat. I couldn't afford to go anywhere really. But in the late 80s, we did, and I took my husband there for the first time. And the first time we arrived, it was sort of, we did arrive in the day, which put a whole different complexion on it. But it was a bit like the place had started to gain some colour. I know that sounds really strange, but it was not as monochrome as it had been. We went with my son, who was a little child at the time. And this being Turkey, I realised that, you know, this child was going to get worshipped everywhere it went. Mm-hmm. And he did. And he still goes back to Turkey a lot. And now he goes back to Turkey with his son, which is really, really nice. And we went to Istanbul. We used to stay, we went a couple of times a year for about 5-6 years. We used to stay in a hotel, well, it wasn't a hotel, I don't know what you call it really, in Yerebatan Caddesi in Istanbul. And it was called the Hotel Stop. We knew the family who ran it. And we could turn up any time of the day or night, it didn't matter. And they always had beds for us. Sometimes they were their beds. It was really, really cheap. It was really, really friendly. We met extraordinary people there. The first time I ever met somebody he was actually American, and he was a convert to Islam. And he was a Sufi. And he was this tall, spiritual man who would come out with pronouncements. He obviously had money, but he wanted to stay at the Hotel Stop because he loved the people there. It was an extraordinary place. And my son, of course, was, you know, treated like a little emperor when we went there. Some of the things about that place, you know, we had water cups, I remember, which resulted in all of us, the whole family, being in a room with a big boiler thing that suddenly didn't have any water in it. We were all soaked and naked, 3 of us, no water at all, and we just had to sit on the floor until the water came back. But that was okay. What was interesting was there was another bathroom next to that, and there were 2 Americans in there who just screamed the whole time, which was bizarre. But they had never come across water shortages before. It was a very, very strange thing. Also, this place had loads and loads of cats. I love Istanbul street cats because I love cats anyway, and we've adopted many of them over the years. And this entire family, this constantly pregnant mother and her tribe of, you know, tiny kittens, slightly bigger kittens, grown-up kittens, just used to come and sleep with us. And I know other people in there used to say, look, you shouldn't let them do that, you'll get fleas. But we were kind of okay with that. We were young, it didn't really matter. So that's where we used to stay. And then the other place we used to go to was Side on the coast, which was a village at the time. It was really beautiful. It was full of quite unusual outre kind of people. I met a woman on the beach there. She was, her father had been an Ottoman general, but he had been Austrian, and her mother was Turkish in the First World War. And she, again, was very old and very grand, and it was full of people like that. There was a whole group of local hippies, because people say, well, there weren't any Turkish hippies. Well, there were. They came a bit later, but there was a whole group of people sort of playing guitars and hanging out on the beach, and it was a really, really wonderful time. And of course we used to do these hugely long bus journeys across the country as well, which my son was absolutely brilliant with. You know, you think small child is just going to scream the whole way, but of course, you know, the people on the coach all took him to their hearts, and so I didn't actually have to look after him for those bus journeys. I think we did a couple of 12-hour ones, and various people took him over, you know, so that was okay. Side over the years has become quite a significant place for us. I mean, I've not been there for a number of years. I think the last time I went was about 10 years ago, and it was so built up, I didn't know where I was. I know things have to change, you know, development has to happen, but it was so disorientating that I may well go back there, but, you know, it still feels a bit strange to me. I guess the weirdest thing that happened in Side was the Temple of Apollo. Do you know the Temple of Apollo on the seafront? Yes. I wasn't with my husband, I was with one of my university friends. She wanted to go to Turkey, so I took her. And we got to this Temple of Apollo, and it was sort of early evening, and she collapsed. And I sort of think, oh my God, what do I do? Is she sick? You know, I just didn't know what to do. She came round, but was screaming. And, you know, I'm not a religious person, I don't know about these things, but it would seem that she had some kind of peculiar flashback that she had been to that temple, you know, as people would glibly say, in another life. And we were so lucky, because I really didn't know what to do with her, because she was screaming and saying, they're killing me. And I thought, what do I do? Has she gone mad? You know, how do I get this woman back to England? You know, she's gone completely crazy. And I have no psychiatric drugs with me, even though that's what I worked in. But we were very fortunate in as much as there was a local family who were passing, mum, dad, 2 kids. And I don't know whether they knew what was going on, or they just decided that they needed to help these crazy people, or what, but they took us back to their house. And, you know, they laid her down on this sofa and sort of covered her with blankets and gave her tea, and said to me, you know, she will be all right, you know. And it was the most weird sort of experience. I've had a few of those. I've been met by people in Cappadocia that, you know, I'm thinking, well, how did you get here? You know, what does this mean? And as I say, I'm not a spiritual person, but sometimes there's a couple of British authors who describe themselves as psychogeographers. Ian, the other one, the main one is Michael Moore. Alan Moore and Michael Moorcock. I always get those mixed up. They are quite sort of spooky, spiritual kind of people, but they say, I mean, London is their speciality, and I can relate to this with London myself as well. They say that time at various points in London is very thin, and you can see the past and you can see the future. I don't know, but it gives you a bit of a chill, doesn't it? And I wonder sometimes, you know, if it happens in this country, it's got to happen in other countries, hasn't it? So yes, also in the 80s, one of our relatives went to live in Ankara, and we'd never been to Ankara before, so you can imagine that I had an absolutely wonderful time looking at all the Soviet-style buildings, boring everybody else to death. But I do remember, and I haven't managed to get it into a book yet, and I don't suppose I probably will now, but the Citadel. You know, you've got the Hittite Museum and you have the Citadel, which, you know, you look at all these pictures of Ankara, and it's not until you get there that you realise that that is all there as well. And it was extraordinary because, for those of you that remember it, it is like a village in the middle of a city. Last year, Pat Yale, who was here earlier in the year talking about Gertrude Bell, Pat Yale and myself, we went to an open cistern, pardon me, in farting, and it's got a park built in it now, the ATS cistern, and we discovered that there used to be a village in there. And that absolutely fascinated me, and I did find out about it, and I did put it into a book. But that was how Ankara struck me, because you had all this, you know, sort of brutalist modernity, and then suddenly there was this village. And it was really, really villagey as well. You know, you go from this tower block and there's a goat. Yes, that's really quite amazing. But that said, things were changing even then. I mean, I think a lot of people, I have a real bee in my bonnet about gentrification, because where I lived in East London, I can't afford to live there anymore now. And my children can't afford to live there anymore because it has been gentrified, and this is a double-edged sword. I get it, I understand why it happens, but I don't have to like it. My big beef with it is that when it happens, ordinary people are not always taken into account. I went in more recent times to Sulukule in Istanbul, where the Roma people used to live. Yeah, I know, it was a mess and it needed dealing with, but those people also needed a bit more help than they got. And that is what happens everywhere. That's what's happened in London, and it's just accelerating. So gentrification was taking place even then, and we saw it. It was quite interesting, actually. I have a friend who lives in Balat, and his family they're real old Balat people, and he lives in the house where his grandparents lived. So even back then, I was kind of going to those sort of areas, but he was a bit like a sort of a pioneer at the time, because, you know, poor people lived in Balat, professional people didn't tend to. But I remember him introducing, in his garden one evening, he introduced us to a group of his friends who all lived locally, and they were all renovating houses in the area. And it was quite tough in those days because people would say, well, why are you living there? You know, are you mad? But actually, you know, I mean, unless things fall apart completely with the world economy, you know, they seem to have done quite well so far. But at the time, it was all a bit eccentric, you know. It wasn't really until the 1990s that I started going to Turkey every year, and I have been every year ever since, at least once, except for last year. This year, unless I go tomorrow, which I suppose I could do.
Of course you could.
I could do, yeah. I went to Iceland instead. Bit different. Very expensive. Don't go unless you've got loads of money. I'm now completely skinned. So the 90s were interesting because one of the things that struck me in the early 90s, and again it's in the books, was things like suddenly there were all these Russians, as you'll probably remember, and there were all these signs in Cyrillic in places like Galilee, and you had the suitcase men, yes. Who could get a bit demanding, shall we say, sometimes, who would chase after you with their knockoff perfume and say, oh yes, it's genuine Chanel, and go, oh yeah, all right then. So we had Russians and Chechens and suitcases of looted icons. I remember a friend said to me one day he'd heard that there was going to be an icon sale down at Iminonu. Some guy that he'd met on the street said that this bloke that he knew was going to sell all these icons from a church in Kiev. Get down there. So I sort of thought, well, I'll go down and see, you know, because maybe I can rescue some of them. And it was the most tragic thing you've ever seen, because they'd obviously hacked them off walls. And they were all irrevocably damaged. And it was just awful. And, you know, I know they'd been brought up under the communist system and what have you, but I can't believe that they had that little regard. They were in a terrible place at that time. They were so poor over there. You know, they used to sort of call it the Black Sea Ferry. You know, they'd come over, they'd try and stay if they could. And then, of course, we had the problem of the ladies that were known as the Natashas, which became a bit of a problem, actually, because I apparently look Russian, I'm told. My ancestors were Eastern European, and, you know, yeah, so everywhere I went for about 5 years, it was you know, I couldn't stop in a shop doorway and look at something because I would be accosted. And even if my husband was with me, he's very dark and he's bearded, and they would assume he was my pimp. And it just went on. And I remember I really lost it big style one day. I was actually crossing, because I've always felt safe in Turkey. I think I do take a view as well with the way one comports oneself, you know. If you go about wearing a skirt up to here and you wander around like this, you know, please don't touch me, you know, everybody's going to touch you because you look weak. So I sort of stride out and I take the view, I have this expression on my face which is, don't even think about it. I'm from East London, I don't take any crap. So there I am, striding across the Galata Bridge, you know, the car stops, you know, and it's sort of, you know, sum of money is mentioned, and I lost screaming and shouting. Oh, rain, every English expletive you can imagine, and the poor guy, I mean, I felt really sorry for him. But it kind of got better after that. But it was quite overwhelming, particularly in the early 90s. I remember we we used to go to Chichek Passage, and there were lots and lots of Russians there, and we were there one night. It was actually our wedding anniversary, and we decided that we'd have a meal at one of the restaurants. And as you know, you share tables, and that's absolutely fine. You know, everybody was having a good time, the raka was flowing and everything. And suddenly, everybody at our table just got up and left. And we thought, oh, well, I don't know, we'll stay here, we're drunk, you know, why move? And then this man arrived, and he was, I suppose if you put the three of us together, he was about that wide, and he was wearing a leather jacket. I mean, you know, Russian gangster, it was just, he was an archetype. He had this tiny little girl with him, and all these other great big lumping things, you know. And as they sat down, they all moved their jackets to one side like that so that we could see their firearms. And it's sort of, you know, this English couple, slightly drunk, on their wedding anniversary evening. You know, we're not going to give them any trouble, are we, really? But they thought that we might give them trouble. They were wrong. It was also in the 1990s that I discovered Cappadocia, and I didn't meet Pat until 2000, Pat Yale, who until recently was living in a cave house in Cappadocia. That all came a bit later, but we decided that we would go to Cappadocia, and I did actually set a book there called Dance with Death. It was one of these peculiar, very odd sort of experiences where things happen, and it tests your atheism, you know, it really does. And my husband's saying, you know, do you think these things really exist? You know, do they? So we turned up, we got a bus from Ankara, and we turned up in the middle of the night, and we were met by an old man who looked like a gnome, who called himself Mr. Ikmen. Yes, that was a bit strange. Then we met a very peculiar Englishman, and yes, they are still about. You know, we had the elderly ladies when I went there in the 70s. Well, it was sort of crazy, kind of whacked out Englishman with strange religious beliefs in the 90s, or so it seemed. And we met Malcolm. And we met him when we were going to Derinkuyu, the underground city, which was a wonderful experience, although when we got right down to the bottom of it, the graveyard that the Christians used, and the guide turns the light out, I did think I had died, because it is total darkness. It's you can feel it. It's the most bizarre experience. So we had that, and also prior to that, we were going down into the underground city, and there was a police officer at the entrance who was just ushering people down. And I already had my characters, I'd already written a book about them, but I couldn't publish it. And this, I remember I said, because I stood there looking at this poor man, and he probably thought, oh God, another lunatic from the UK. And my husband said to me, why are you staring at that guy? And I said, because he is Mehmet Suleiman. And he was absolutely my vision of that particular character. So that was quite odd. But then, as I say, we had Malcolm, who was a strange Englishman, who went down into the city with us, but did not come up. And there was a big emergency, because it's, 20 of us went down, 19 of us came out. So what's all this about? So anyway, they called the troops out, and, he's obviously fallen over down there, maybe he's hurt himself, Hours later, he rolls back into Göreme, where we were staying, And quite why he wasn't prosecuted for this, I don't know, but maybe this, well, somebody actually told me this does happen from time to time. He belonged to some weird sect who believed that enlightenment could only come about through complete darkness. And apparently he got himself into this crevice between two rocks, and he was waiting for God. And then they came and got him, and he hated them. And he said, "I'm going back." And one of the police officers in Gurame said, "You know, this is not the first time. Not him, but others. You know, they go down there." Apparently, prior to that, there were some Australians that went down and didn't want to come up. Quite what that's about, I absolutely have no idea. But I also remembered, those of you who like travel writing, you may remember an author called Christina Dodwell. She did a lot of travelling in the 60s and 70s. She went to Africa, I believe she went to South America. I used to read her books when I was a kid. And I remember one book that she wrote, she went to Cappadocia. And she went into the underground cities, and there was a power cut. And so instead of doing what I would have done, which would have been scream and run around like a headless chicken and probably kill myself, Christina, who is, you know, a very sort of straightforward public school educated lady, lay down and waited to be rescued. And I remember being absolutely lost in admiration for that, thinking, that woman's marvellous. How can she do that? I would have been dead, you know, my heart would have stopped. But I did become fascinated, and when I met Pat Yale and all the people in Gurame, it was wonderful. And you know, in this century, we can say that now. I've spent a lot of time there. I actually spent a couple of months in Pat's house looking after her tribe of cats. Which was a wonderful experience because she did have a cave house with a fairy chimney. Wonderful structures, beautiful place, and just such a magical experience. I was so privileged to be able to do that. I was only frightened once because I was there on my own with all these animals. I was only frightened once because the house next door was empty, but there was a door between the two houses, and it was just, you know, locked. And one night I heard noises in there. I thought, oh God, somebody's got in. I'm going to have to deal with this all on my own. The previous night we'd had a wolf howling. You could hear a wolf in the distance because it's winter. And so I thought, I've got to go in there because I need to know, because all Pat's things are here. If we've got burglars, I need to find out whether they're in the house next door. So I put some clothes on and I was standing by this door. I opened the door like this. And there were a selection of Pat's cats, because I think she had about 14 at the time, playing tennis with a dead mouse. I was so relieved, I cried. But it was, you know, it was just a wild experience. So, as I say, I wrote a book, which I'll bring up in a minute. I'm sorry, I'm not the most technological being on the planet, but I do have a little reading here. From the book which is called Dance with Death, which is based upon the time that I spent in the house in Cappadocia. And it's a description of landscape. The literal meaning of the word Cappadocia, which is of Persian origin, is land of the beautiful horses. Quite why the Persians had apparently overlooked its other delights which even in ancient times had been around for about 30 million years, is puzzling. But then maybe the Persians were just simply knocked out by the bloodstock they came across in the area. Either that, or they didn't feel confident enough to allude to what can be extremely rude-looking rock formations. Those of you who know Cappadocia, these things are called fairy chimneys, but some people call them other things because some of these structures have a resemblance to the male member. I remember being on a bus one day with two Australians, and they didn't want to say anything about it. They were trying not to laugh. And then a Turkish guy who was sitting across from them just said, "Just laugh. Just do it. We know." So that sort of, yeah. For every cone-shaped column of tufa topped by a precarious-looking lump of volcanic rock, there are, in some parts of the region at least, 3 that are exactly the image of an erect penis. In some cases, there are entire valleys populated by fairy chimneys of this shape. Lunar in character and deeply weird in more than a few places, the landscape of Cappadocia was formed by the collision of 2 tectonic plates and by the eruption of the now extinct volcanoes of Mounts Erciyes and Hasan. These eruptions caused the whole region to be blanketed in ash that eventually solidified into tufa, which in turn eroded into the odd shapes that the region is famous for. Spooky and barren, even from the earliest times, Cappadocia has a reputation for being haunted not only by ghosts from its Hittite and Byzantine past, but also by the Peres, or fairies, for whom, some would say, a higher power had especially created the chimneys. I actually, again, you know, it's one of those places that attracts people. Not only, you know, you're never sure with people who've always lived in an area, particularly if it's a tourist place. You think, are they having a laugh? But I did meet one particular person who I actually believed. He said he'd seen fairies in the valleys, but you know, it's the effect I think that it has on certain types of people who go and live there voluntarily, whether they're Turkish or whether they're foreign. They seem to go a bit nuts when they go there. I met a French lady, I'm afraid, who had this notion that that if you danced naked in the valleys, that it was very, very healthy.
I do that all the time.
Yes, I think we should.
You don't have to go to.
You don't actually, no. And this caused comment, as you can probably imagine. This was deemed to be extremely weird. And there was a whole sort of dancing school. Again, it was, I think the person who organised this was a German, and it was like Isadora Duncan dancing. There were all these women. You know, you come across this sort of stuff. It's like we came across a hermit one day as well, but he was a long-term resident. But we came across all these women, mainly Germans, who were all wearing very sort of flimsy things and dancing amongst the chimneys. It was, you know, it was good. I wasn't tempted to join in because I don't do that sort of thing, but it was interesting, shall we say. So that was sort of, you know, I mean, I'm mixing up time frames now, but to sort of come forward into this century, which still sounds like a really peculiar thing to say. I think, from my observations, I've probably seen more, and I think this is accurate, I've seen more change in Turkey in the last 15, 16 years than any of the years beforehand. And like my character, some of it is good and some of it isn't. And it's things like, you know, if you were a foreigner and you went to the country now, there are certain things that I have said to people, you know, somebody I know who went to Turkey recently to a tourist resort, and I said, you know, and we were talking about, he went into a barber's shop and said, oh, I had a really good shave, you know, a really good haircut, because you do get really good shaves and haircuts in Turkey. So I said, you know, was there a photograph of Ataturk on the wall? And he said, who? And okay, I know he's a foreigner, so I described what Ataturk looked like. And he said, no, there's nothing like that. And it's, you know, that is something that you have to get used to. The other thing, of course, are the massive buildings in Istanbul, which I must admit, you know, I as a lover of Soviet buildings, I'm not really keen on these modern things, you know. They're only a pale imitation, really, except for things like the Gherkin in London, which I think is a clever building. But a lot of the buildings that have been put up in Istanbul in the last 15 years are a lot like the buildings that have been put up here. They are just lumps. I actually call them lumps because they have, you know, they don't have a huge amount of merit. The jury's still out about the Shard. I don't really know what I think about the Shard, but we will see. When I first went to Turkey, I did not have, and this happened over many years, and this included friends and acquaintances and all sorts of people. I did not have any conversations about religion at all. I mean, you know, I have to own up here that I avoid those conversations because when you're a lapsed Catholic, you don't want to go there, really, quite honestly, you know, because even now, you know, it's not an easy thing to talk about. I don't believe in any of it. I think a lot of it's wrong. But so I don't put myself out there to have those conversations. And I remember once a very sort of touching thing, that was back in the 70s actually, which was an acquaintance of mine who one day very shyly and very reverently showed me his copy of the Quran. And it was just, look, this is my Quran. And it was sort of, there, you've seen it now. I said, very nice, thank you. And it was only later I realised what a big thing that was. But now, of course, people do talk to you, and I found myself in a very difficult situation where a guy buttonholed me in Sultan Ahmet Square a few years ago and almost pushed me up against a wall to find out what religion I was. And luckily, I'm the sort of person, as you can probably gather, I do lose my temper. And I lost my temper, and I think I really frightened him, actually. And I said, it's not your business, it's not important. But it was, for me, that was a strange moment, because, you know, that's something that hadn't happened before. Significant things that happened in the 21st century was that in 2012, I was very fortunate. I was invited to stay at the Pera Palace Hotel in Agatha Christie's room 411. And in return for that, I had to give them a talk, which I did. And it was absolutely wonderful because, as you probably know, the hotel's been renovated. We actually stayed there, my husband and I, in the 80s, when it was a really kind of dusty, you know, it was like the Laundra Hotel, which we stayed at once. Yes, yeah, we were a bit bothered by a parrot there. Yeah, but The renovation is absolutely spectacular. I didn't know what I'd think of it, but it's got a glass roof on it now, and it's absolutely fabulous. And it was really nice staying in Agatha Christie's room, and I completely regressed to the back end of the East End of London. They've fitted it out beautifully. It's all very much in the right era, but they've put in a new bathroom. And so you have this wonderful sort of 1920s bath, and there's all these wonderful things that you can put into it. And there's also a rain shower as well. And that evening, as I was getting ready for dinner, I drew myself a bath. I had a bath, and then I had a shower, and then I went back in the bath, and then I went back in the shower again. It was pitiful. It was truly pitiful, but it was absolutely wonderful. And the book that I set there is called Deadline, and I will read you a little bit from Deadline, because it tells you about the Pera Palace Hotel. There's a character who goes into the hotel who is called Lale, and she is a crime writer. She's a Turkish crime writer. And like me, she comes from a very poor background, but she has really made it. She's made proper money, and she is now at the top of her game, and she's going into the Pera Palace Hotel. Getting out of the taxi, she tried to look cool, as if she'd been going to such places all her life. And she achieved her aim. But try as she might, when she looked up at the historic and magnificent facade, she knew that this hotel was just about as far as anyone could get from her old village home in Anatolia. This was the Pera Palace, where people arriving in Istanbul via the Orient Express would stay back in the first half of the 20th century. It was the hotel where Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, founder of the Republic, liked to stay. Oh, and I saw his room as well, which is fabulous. Where King Edward VIII of England had slept, as well as Greta Garbo, Ernest Hemingway, Mata Hari and Jackie Onassis. I should add here as well that the other person who stayed at that hotel was somebody that my father knew for various reasons, who was King Zog of Albania, an extraordinary man who spoke 6 languages, survived. He gave this speech and he was shot 5 times and survived, and he smoked 100 cigarettes a day. So, a bit of a survivor there. But most importantly, for crime novelist Lale Akhtar, the great English crime fiction writer Agatha Christie had stayed here too. And she, Lale Akhtar, a woman from the back end of nowhere, was going to spend a night in what had been her room. As Lale walked underneath the brightly lit canopy towards the gleaming Art Nouveau entrance, the door into the hotel quietly and seemingly automatically opened in front of her. A young man wearing the smart grey Pera Palace uniform said, "Good morning, madam. Welcome to the Pera Palace. May I take your bag?" Lale gave her small, lightweight suitcase to him without a word. She looked at her surroundings, exquisite marble flooring, doors and fittings of highly polished oak and mahogany, even a brightly decorated Christmas tree, and she thought, I've arrived. Even though she was Turkey's best-selling crime author and she was married to one of the country's most wealthy men, only now, here, did she feel she had actually arrived. It was just a pity her stay at the hotel was going to be so short. Because what I did was I actually, in the story, I organised a crime fiction conference in the Pera Palace Hotel, and it all kind of goes wrong, and people get shot, and people die because it's what I do. So that's that. Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's been The last 15 years have actually been great because I've done a huge amount of things. I've done a lot of things that I wanted to do. One of the things I haven't been able to do was, and I plan to do it this year, I wanted to go to a church in Balat called the Church of the Holy Archangels. Excuse me. Which every 16th of September there is a service overnight and there is a miracle, it is said. One person is cured of whatever on that night. And I mean, you know, it turns your stomach a bit, but apparently, you know, this is an Armenian ceremony, but they also practice animal sacrifice. And I thought, you know, this is so strange. I maybe should see this, and I wanted to sort of weave it in somehow, but I didn't actually get to do it. But I have, in the last 15 years, been to places like Mardin, which is an absolutely fabulous city. We went there for Easter some years ago, and we went to a Syriac service, which was an extraordinary thing because, of course, it's in Aramaic. And then we were invited to a wedding, as you are. And, you know, that was extraordinary. I was very privileged as well, in as much as I have seen Hasan Kaif, which I don't know how much longer it's got. I hear the people have been, most of the people have moved out now for the new dam. But we did actually get to see it before that happened, so it was still inhabited. And that again is an absolutely fantastic
Still
place.
inhabited,
Sorry?
It's still inhabited.
Is it still inhabited?
Yeah.
They're building the new apartments though, aren't they? They're moving people out. No.
No, just the people in the bank.
Ah.
It's flooded though.
No, it's not flooded.
No, I know it's not flooded. No, but I thought.
3 weeks ago.
Ah.
It's not flooded. And they're refurbishing now the bridge.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that information. Might be able to go back. And again, places that, you know, it's very sad that places that we could go to a few years ago, you can't go to now. Gaziantep. I had a wonderful time in Gaziantep. We discovered, because it's, as you know, it's a lot like an Arab city. So you've got these doorways in walls, and then you go through the doorway and there's a mansion. And I was actually with Pat Yale at the time, and we went down this little alleyway, or so it looked, went through this doorway, and suddenly we were in this fantastic courtyard, and it was all deserted, and there was this house, and it was open. You could, but it was like Miss Havisham's house from Great Expectations. It was like somebody had just left. So there was an old radio there with all the dials in French. There was furniture that was sort of rotting into the floor, and there was these wonderful paintings. And it was just like somebody had got up and walked away, which was extraordinary. Another peculiar experience. One of my favourite parts of Istanbul is actually an area that's being developed at the moment, partially developed. And I should just finish with this because I have a friend who has a house there in Cappadocia. And my friend has a very beautiful Greek house. She has, there are pictures on the ceilings. The ceilings are decorated. It's a vast place. She's an American and her husband is Turkish, and they bought this house very, very long time ago. And they've watched the district change over, because, you know, it can be a rough area. It's not for the faint-hearted. You know, and she said at various points she can kind of understand why the state want to redevelop this area, because it is full of drug dealers and criminals, but it's also got a wonderful community. And it's an extraordinary place, and I just hope that, I mean, at the moment her house seems to be safe, but they've redeveloped parts of Tribulations. I think it's stopped for the time being. But as I say, it's an area that I'm very fond of because I can kind of really relate to it. It's the area where I guess a lot of the people have ended up there because they're poor, because they can't find anywhere else to live. And, that's what my ancestors did in East London. People have to live somewhere. And I just hope that somehow they can keep going. So that's really my sort of reflection on my time in Turkey. Of course, it's not all of it. I could talk about Mardin and the strange being that inhabits the area called the Shamaran. I don't know whether you've come across that, the snake goddess. I could just go on, but you get bored. So, is there anything anybody wants to talk about or share your experiences?
Well, first of all, let's thank our speaker. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. Please.
There are two things. Going back to the Pera Palace Hotel, I went there just after it reopened, after its refurbishment, and I thought it was truly magnificent. But I was devastated when I went to see the Ataturk apartment, because I don't know, did you go into it before?
I didn't. I only went into it latterly. Yeah.
Well, before it was exactly as he had lived in it, and it was full. It was terribly dusty and so on, but it was very interesting because it was full of little books where he had made notes on how to transliterate Turkish into the Roman script, and all sorts of fascinating anecdotes, little pieces of paper and notebooks and paraphernalia connected with him. And the manager, who very kindly decided to take us around, proudly showed us this room, and it was devoid of anything that seemed to be personal to him. And I said, well, what happened to all this stuff? What happened to all his notebooks, his hats, this, because there were clothes that belonged to him? And so he said, I don't know. And I said, well, you must know. I mean, these are it's terribly important, all this stuff. He said, well, I've no idea. And I've never been able to find out what happened to all this material. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, I'm just reading your book, Land of the Blind, and I'm very interested how political it is. Have you had any repercussions about that?
No, not so far. The trouble is...
Alors, what's the social context? Because there's always a political and social context in each of your book, but I don't remember. Land of the Blind is what?
It's the background to it is Gezi.
Ah, right.
And development.
Yeah. It's very difficult. As writers, I belong to the Society of Authors, and we have a lot of discussion about these sort of matters, not just pertaining to Turkey, but everywhere. How do you, especially in today's world, how do you write about somewhere and keep the political out of it? And it's almost impossible. I have really tried to be even-handed. I mean, with that particular book, the developer that I talk about, I do try and humanise him, because I am very aware that my first sort of knee-jerk reaction with these people is always to see them as demons, because they are knocking things down. Which is why, one of the reasons why in that book I gave him a kind of a reason to be as ambitious as he is. He had a daughter with learning difficulties, because it's kind of putting it into a context that I think most of us can understand. You know, things make you ambitious. I mean, you don't necessarily need a reason like that. Poverty is generally enough. But it is something that we all struggle with. I mean, the big sort of problem that we are all going to come up against, whether we are American or not, is we have to live in a world with Mr. Trump. And, you know, how's that going to shake out in fiction? I don't know. I know a few writers who write about America who, you know, say, well, you know, it's quite difficult because, you know, once it all starts, I suppose it will get easier. But how much are we going to be allowed to say? They're Americans, they're not used to censoring themselves. But maybe they'll have to be. I don't know. Because none of us as yet know how Mr. Trump is going to be with all that sort of business. We understand he's a very thin-skinned individual. He may put up with no criticism of himself at all.
I find your books quite to be page-turners. Did you do a course anywhere in writing, or where did you get the inspiration from?
No. I studied psychology at university. All I can say is I think psychology gives you a sense of the dramatic. It's sort of, I guess, part of it is common sense. And it's also your observation from your own reading. You know, if I'm reading an academic book, I want it to tell me the information that I need. If I'm reading a thriller, I want it to thrill me, and I want it to engage and interest me. So I try and write those sorts of things. Courses do help some people. You know, I have known, you know, there's some very famous writers who've done courses. I'm not against it. It's just I was actually, when I wrote the books until 10 years ago, I was working in a psychiatric hospital. And then I was working in the community. And so I didn't actually have time to do anything like that. I used to come home from work and write. It was a kind of, I don't know, a catharsis, because crime fiction is fantasy, really, because it's presenting an ideal world. It's like the cowboy films, you know, the white hats and the black hats and the good guys always win, you know. The world I lived in, the world I worked in, was very different to that, because people would come to us. It was a medium secure unit. People would come to us and there would be no resolution, because they had been deemed by the psychiatrists that they were too mentally ill to stand trial, so they would be sent to the unit. Often they didn't know they'd committed an offence. If they did, they probably had a very peculiar view of what they had done. And we always used to say, you know, with our patients, there's no closure for anybody, because the relatives of their victims also would experience no closure, because they would often say, you know, why are you caring for this person who's killed my husband, you know, probably in a very horrific way, in a place where he gets a room of his own, you know, it's not a prison. Why are you doing this? And we, you know, for us to explain, well, you know, this man thought your husband was the devil, or whatever. There was no closure for that person, because they think, well, he's still there. He's not in prison. There was no closure for the patient either, because they would, I mean, the job was to medicate them into a position where they could understand what they'd done. But that's not possible with everybody. We had a young man who who lived in a giant supercomputer and in his head. And, you know, he was given industrial amounts of medication to try and bring him out of this delusion. And he did come out of it briefly, and it was the most appalling thing to witness, because suddenly he realised that he was a murderer and he couldn't cope with it. And it was a cruel thing to do to him. And then luckily, he went back into his delusion. But, you know, so it's a very imperfect world. And I understand as well, even when you have got offenders who go to prison in the normal course of events, you know, it's generally very messy. It's not, you know, all neatly tied up like it generally is in crime fiction. Yeah.
I'd like to know why you came about, or how you came about creating a Turkish character.
Well, I didn't really. The original book, I couldn't understand why, at the time, in the early 90s, there were not many fiction books set in Turkey, and in Istanbul particularly. Because this city that's so fascinating and so multi-layered and so labyrinthine and interesting, nobody's set anything there since Eric Ambler in terms of Western fiction. And I wrote it. I didn't. The police were just vehicles to solve the crime. I didn't. You know, that was not why I wrote it. I wrote it with my psychologist hat on because the family that were in it, they had self-isolated, so they'd cut themselves off from the world. And I was very interested in that. I wanted to explore that. How does that affect people? What kind of fantasies do they come up with to justify their existence? And a friend of mine had told me that there was an old legend in Istanbul that one of the Tsar's daughters had actually arrived in the city. And I kind of put those things together. So that's what it was about. And I was more shocked than anybody else when publishers, because I didn't know about series or anything really. I knew that some big authors had series, but I just thought, well, I've written a book and somebody's going to publish it and they've given me some money, so that's really good. And then they said, no, we want more books. And I said to them, well, you can't have them because I've killed everyone. I've killed the family. And they said, no, those characters. And it hadn't occurred to me. So the whole thing was meant to really stop there, but it carried on. And I think there's a great thing about writing stuff that you want to read, you know, and I think most writers do that. You know, if you talk to any writer, particularly with something like crime, and you'll say to them, so, you know, why did you set this? I mean, some of the locations are outlandish. I mean, it's brilliant because I met a whole load of Icelandic and Scandinavian authors when I was in Reykjavik the other week. And, you know, they've got this whole other landscape and, you know, things that they want to bring to the genre. And there's also British writers that are writing about Iceland, you know, and it's absolutely fascinating. All their legends, all their folklore. And it is, you know, and you say to them, well, why did you, one of the Icelandic writers, he set a murder in a most extraordinary graveyard in Reykjavik, which is one of the weirdest places I have ever been to. Because it looks quite conventional for a Christian graveyard, you know, it's got trees and all the rest of it. But then you hear the story behind it, because they actually had the graveyard before they had the church. So there were no churches in Reykjavik, there was just this graveyard. So they used to have church services in this graveyard amongst the tombs. The graveyard was also used as a mortuary, and they were telling these stories from their grandparents about people getting married in this graveyard with a coffin over there. I mean, strange stuff. But, you know, so you say, well, why did you set it there? Well, that's why he set it there, because it's got this incredible history that people outside of Iceland don't really know about.
But if you had any, you said you haven't had any negative responses, but what about the sort of general response you've had from your Turkish readers? Are they enthusiastic with the way that you said
The people that I have spoken to, yes. I mean, now, which is great, there are Turkish crime writers. I met Ahmed Umit a couple of years ago. He's very good. And, you know, obviously, it's, you know, this is a good thing. But there's room for everybody. Yes, I mean, I don't know. Whether the readers are Turkish, British or Icelandic or whatever it is they are, I am still, as a writer, at the stage where I find it difficult to accept sometimes that people are not just being polite.
Well, people are happy not to be polite if you upset them. So clearly,
Yeah, I don't think of it. I mean, I might, you know, it's, as I said, with the political situation, it's a difficult one. It's, you know, it's something that I do struggle with. I think what people probably don't realise is that it's something that I struggle with when I write about the UK as well. About the gentrification of London. I have had some, because British people with a British writer are much more likely to go for you, and I have had some negative stuff about that.
I find it interesting that I discovered you in Istanbul. I hadn't heard of you in London at all. I discovered you in Turkish translation, and then I found the English books in Turkish libraries.
Oh, right.
So that's very rare for an English writer.
I know, it's... I mean, one of the things that I found interesting when I went to Iceland was we tend to think that Scandinavia, they're all very liberal, you know, and it's all very safe and everything. But actually, you know, there's this kind of seething undercurrent in places like Sweden and also in Iceland, where, you know, some of the writers have had death threats because there are gangs there, and I'm, you know, I'm driving around Reykjavik thinking, oh, this is really nice, you know, and they're saying, well, you know, there's a gang, you know, this block of flats here, you know, it's the so-and-so gang. I mean, there's only about 5 of them. It's not like the gangs here, you know, with the 200. But even so, it's you're never quite sure. The book I'm writing at the moment is one of the things that really fascinates me. It's sort of going back to that church I was telling you about in Balat. Is although I'm not a religious person, I am absolutely fascinated by the concept of miracles. I think it was being exposed to that film that we had at school, The Song of Bernadette, and then various, you know, people that I know went to Lourdes and this sort of thing. And you think, now, can that be real? You know, can that be? So I am actually working on a miracle that is sort of attached to a particular structure in Istanbul. And I am going to go to a place called Fatima in the new year, which is in Portugal. which is a big pilgrimage site where there's supposed to be all these miracles, but also because of the phenomena that surround that. Apparently they saw the sun revolve, and there were all these sort of strange things that occurred. I'm not going to replicate that in my book, not to that extent, but I need to play with that. I don't know why, but I do.
But it is an Ikmen book.
Yeah.
The one based in the Pera Palace, I was very concerned because I thought you were retiring him.
Yeah.
And then you changed your mind.
No, I just did that to wind people up.
I was just thinking, I was telling my husband, well, that's it, that's the last, he's retiring.
No.
But then he came back.
I'm gonna.
When are you going to retire him?
Oh, I think
because that's the problem, he's getting on.
I know, I'll have to kill him, I think.
Oh, don't kill him.
No, I did once kill Suleiman, I did. And my editor said, you can't do this, sorry.
He was very sick one, but not dead.
No.
It's like Rebus.
Well, that's where I got the idea from, because that thing I said, I met Ian Rankin.
He did retire him.
Oh, yes, he did.
And then he came back as the parallel dead cases investigator.
This is where
That's what you're going to do.
This is where I name drop now. Ian Rankin actually said to me, oh, just stop time, love. He said, don't worry about it. He said, because it doesn't matter. That's what I've done. And I thought, yeah, well, if he can do it, so can I. So that's what I've done. I don't know. Nobody, you get, there used to be 3 book contracts. They're now 2 book contracts. Most people have 2 book contracts these days. You don't know how much longer they're going to go on for. But I do think that as long as you've got something to say and you can make a case for it, because every time you renegotiate a contract, you have to give them, the publishers, some ideas. You have to say, this is what I'm thinking of. This is, and if they say yes, then...
And how long does it take for you to write a book? Do you research it?
1 week, it's easy, isn't it?
It depends, actually. It depends, some of them have taken, some of them I have slogged away at, particularly when I was still working in the hospital for a year, and I've only just managed to do it, Some of them, it depends sometimes whether you get a sort of brain explosion for... I did with the second book, Chemical Prison. I'd written about half of it and I was doing it at night after work. And then I had a week off. And it was just to have a week off. It was not a holiday or anything like that. And I came down in the morning to where I used to write in the house we lived in at the time. And I thought, I'll do a bit of this. And I started, and a week later I finished the book. And it was like I was possessed. And, I'm not the only person that happens to. So it varies. Because I write 2 series, and I'm also, I've also been contracted to write a saga as well. Which is a new departure for me, so it's a good job I don't work at the hospital anymore. I wouldn't have time. But the saga is going to be, that's based in Brick Lane, in Spitalfields, and it's around 3 young women who are brought up in Brick Lane.
So not a detective?
No, just...
Very different genre.
Yes, very different genre. I think sometimes, not every writer, but some of us, because I've always thought, am I just a one-trick pony? Am I